Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Autism Confidential, the podcast from the National Council on Severe Autism. I am Jill Escher. I'm the president of NCSA, and I am your host today. And I'm also the guest today because it's just me today. So kind of taking a break from our usual interview format. But before I get into the theme of today's podcast, I do want to, of course, acknowledge the fact that we've been on a bit of a hiatus. Well, it's summer 2023, and I've just been walloped by summer. Just travel, taking care, especially of Sophie, taking care of my kids. So much going on with Autism Society San Francisco Bay Area, which is a nonprofit I help run out here in the Bay Area. Just bajillion of activities, and I'm the events chair there, among many other things, and just lots of stuff going on in life. So I just haven't had any bandwidth, and I really apologize for that. Hopefully by the time summer's over, we will be back into the usual swing of things. I am going on vacation for a lot of August, so August will be kind of off the table as well. There are a couple people who wrote in who with things that they wanted me to address, and I still have all of your suggestions, and we will get to some of those. I definitely promise, but just at a slower pace. So sorry about that long introduction. All right, today, what are we going to talk about? Well, yesterday, something really fabulous happened, which is a major piece that I wrote was published in an online newspaper called The Free Press. And I can do a share screen. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can see it. If you're not watching, you can't see it. But here's The Free Press. And here you can say, I'll click on the piece. And it is called The Autism Surge, Lies, Conspiracies, and My Own Kids. I didn't write that title. My title was, Can Autism Be Saved? Which I think, frankly, is a better title, but I trust in the editors at this newsletter, and this is what they chose. And this got a lot of attention. Right now, I think there's about 840 comments, 1,200 likes. This is just in from the subscriber community, and I know it's been getting a lot of sharing out there in the world. It was a very long piece that was based loosely on a TEDx talk that I gave in April this year. And the editors saw the TEDx talk and they really liked it. They liked all the points I brought up. And they said, hey, can you expand on this and do something for our publication? And so, of course, I'm like, I'd be happy to do so. The theme is really about kind of reality checking autism, which is what the TEDx talk was about, and about some of the very hard truths that tend to get sugar coated in the media and in some advocacy circles. So I won't go over it. It was very long. It was like a 3,700 word essay. It was excessively long. I don't know how many people slogged all the way through it, but it talked about really how autism should be viewed as a national emergency, should be treated as a national emergency, but instead we tend to be trying to normalize autism, trivialize autism, sugarcoat autism, and how various factors, including neurodiversity, have sort of, I said, spreading fairy dust of complacency over the autism field at a time when we should be really doubling down, trying to figure out what's causing these incredibly increasing rates of autism, and really, really thinking out loud and much harder about long-term care for those who are disabled by autism. Okay, I'll stop share. So the purpose of this podcast today is to address all the questions, like not all, but the questions that came in the wake of this article. I've never been so flooded by emails, comments, messages. I'm still not through, going through everything. As I said, there were like 840 comments or whatever on this piece. I'm maybe even halfway through those comments and, not all the way through what's in my inboxes. So, but there were themes to the questions and comments that did come in. And so I thought I would just take this podcast to address those. So here we go. Let's see. Number one, a lot of comments on the Free Press website about vaccines. Now, my piece took the position that vaccines don't cause autism. The evidence very squarely and strongly shows that they don't, and that we should just stop and get over it. And it says RFK Jr., stop. I appreciate you talking about autism, but you're really wrong on this point. So a lot of people said, well, Jill, since we still don't know what's causing autism for the most part, why would you even throw out any hypothesis? And I'll tell you why I would pretty much throw out this hypothesis. First of all, we do have repeated research in large cohorts showing that there's no association between early childhood vaccines and autism rates. Second of all, there's no real biologically plausible mechanism between the administration of early childhood vaccines and the development of autism. And I do talk about that in the piece. Now, people say, well, but my kid regressed. And okay, you know what? I remain humble in the face of autism. I can't say what happened in every single case. Are there outliers where there was some association? I mean, I very much doubt it. I won't slam the door on it. But one thing I can say with absolute certainty is vaccines are not a contributing factor to these wildly increasing rates of autism that we see. Am I saying they're completely safe for every child in every case? I am not. But it's not a serious contender as a risk factor, for developing autism. And I talked about, the kind of the neuroscience of autism and what they're finding in terms of what autism means in the brain. And autism, by and large, and again, maybe there's some exceptions here and there, I don't know, but by and large, it is an artifact. Autism is an artifact of early abnormal brain development. The way neurons are born, the way they proliferate, the way they migrate to their proper positions, the way they line up, the way they connect. In fact, we had an episode on this podcast about that with Dr. Manuel Casanova, and I think it would be a great idea to bring on other neuroscientists to discuss, what autism really means on a structural level and a biological level. And vaccines can't cause that. It's impossible. So, I can go on and on about reasons why, but I'll just cite two more. So, the vaccine proponents or hypothesis proponents would say, well, let's look at all the mercury that was in vaccines. Well, when they took out the mercury, autism rates kept going up. And there's also mercury poisoning doesn't look like autism. They're different phenotypes. And also, if there is this sort of inflammatory response to vaccines that cause some sort of brain inflammation, again, the phenotype isn't what you see with, brain-related infections and inflammation like meningitis. You see a very different kind of outcome. So it just doesn't line up for me at all. We have a finite amount of research resources available to us, whether it's through public funding or taxpayer funding right to the NIH, or whether it's, private foundation funding. They're finite funds. I would really want those funds to be addressed to much more promising hypotheses than vaccines. The vaccine hypothesis is, not worth pursuing any longer. Okay, so I hope that helps answer some of the questions. There are like a ton of comments on that. Couldn't believe how much on vaccines there were. I haven't been able to get through all the Twitter stuff. There's so much response to this on Twitter. I assume that, neurodiversity people who are very, very loud on Twitter have pounced on it. I haven't seen that, but again, I just haven't had the time to dig through everything and find it. I did get one email from what seemed to be a young woman who has autism, who basically said that I hate autistic people or something like that, something to that effect. Like I'm an evil, terrible person who hates autistic people. Okay, nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, I spend most of my life with autistic people and I love them absolutely dearly. And I do everything I can to support and help them. And, uh, she's like, well, you want to get rid of us? Oh, well, no, I want to say very plainly, I would love to prevent neurodevelopmental disability where it's possible to do so. I'm not apologizing for that at all. Just as I would love to prevent heart defects and I would love to prevent kidney defects and I would love to prevent spinal defects. I would love to prevent, any serious biological defect from happening, if I could. I think that's our moral imperative as a society. I don't apologize for that at all. It doesn't mean I want to rid the world of people with autism. No, more than anything, I want to support, people with autism. So anyway, you can hold both beliefs in your head at the same time. Isn't that amazing? Okay, now let's go on. Oh, got several comments and a couple, more than a couple emails about Feta. Feta and Muhammad Al-Malidi appear in the piece when I'm talking about autism as a superpower and saying autism is not a superpower. And I gave, of course, the example of their incredibly tragic and painful deaths in a fire in 2020. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who who cried at that story. Thank you to everyone who were moved by their tragedy. I think about them every day, and what can I say? I feel honored that I was able to share something about them with such a wide audience. So, okay, moving on to that. Let's see. More questions. Oh, why aren't more people talking about? Oh, some people, because back to RFK, um, people said, well, RFK at least is talking about autism. I'm like, okay, you're right. I'll give him a point. He gets a point. At least he's a presidential candidate who's talking about, this very serious American crisis and no one else is. But that doesn't mean I think that he should be president. And also, I honestly think that this should be part of every presidential platform. It's such a toxic topic that politicians, in my experience, just sort of cower from it. They're like, I don't understand it. I see all these numbers. I see all these budget requests. I see everything. I don't understand. I don't know what to make of it. And, they kind of cower and they kind of defer to, scientific experts who, again, have not much in terms of explanation to help. So it becomes a kind of invisible issue, I think, in presidential debates. Hopefully that will change over time. Okay. Oh, a lot of people loved the ending section of the piece about how parents can't die because of all of the roles that we play, how expensive it is when we actually lose parents. Just people were really happy to have some light shed on that. And of course, lots of questions about, well, Jill, since we're facing this monumental demand for adult care services and housing, how are we going to solve that, Jill? And of course, I didn't have room in this piece to set forth like lots of legislative ideas and policy brainstorms, but definitely as this crisis grows, as it inevitably will, if you look at the numbers, we will have to find much more efficient and effective ways to serve this population instead of just wishful thinking them into full employment. Because right now it's like, well, everybody can get a competitive integrated job. And, that's the way to, address the growing number of adults with developmental disability. I'm like, that's great when it works. But have you met my children? I mean, so obviously we need many, many more types of programs, not less. Right now, what we're doing is we're reducing the number and types of support programs for adults with autism and developmental disabilities. We're reducing the number and types of housing situations. We just need to open the floodgates to like every possible variation and permutation of day program, employment program, housing program, instead of like marching on this insane path where like everybody has to like do one thing, because that's inevitably going to fail. It's a total recipe for failure. And in terms of the funding, we're gonna have to increase the budgets over time. We just will. And we could probably be more efficient in how we spend our money. I can't believe I could do probably 20 podcast episodes about the amount of waste in our system. So that's another thing. We have to make sure every single dollar the taxpayers spend on this goes to good use to support people who can't support themselves. Okay. What else? I don't want to go on too much longer. Couple of questions about genetics. People seemed confused. I don't blame them about what I wrote about autism being heritable, but not genetic. So let me try to explain it a little bit. So when you look at, let me start off by saying, like, in the piece I say it's commonly said that autism is genetic. You hear that all the time. Autism's genetic. And that's not true. It's just not true. It's a radical oversimplification and mischaracterization of what the research shows. If the research shows anything, it shows that autism, by and large, is not genetic in the classic sense. Instead, and if you look at the studies, I mean, some studies say like, 10% of the cases in this cohort have, a genetic defect that explains the autism. And some others are like, this is like 14% of cases can be explained by, genetic variants. And then another one might be like 20% if it's limited to a more impaired population. Okay, whatever, we can quibble about how much it is. It's probably about a quarter of cases can be attributed to rare genetic defects, usually de novo, but sometimes a kind of like a recessive, gene that got passed through and ended up manifesting in the kids. And so it's not genetic, but what the research shows over and over and over again across many types of studies is that autism is very heritable. You're like, well, Jill, what's the difference? There's no difference between genetics and heritability. It's the same thing, you dummy. And what I tried to explain in the piece, but obviously did a very poor job of it, because plenty of people didn't understand, is that heritability, it's a strange concept in the world of genetics. It's not easy to explain what it actually means. But usually what people mean is that autism has a high recurrence rate among siblings. It doesn't mean that autism is passed down through the generations, like we see with like Huntington's disorder or cystic fibrosis or something like that, right? Where there's a gene that's passed down. That's never been found. In fact, a very large study in Sweden really found quite emphatically that autism is not passed down through the generations, but it is highly recurring on a horizontal level, like in one generation. So among siblings, among half siblings, to a lesser degree among cousins. That is what they mean by heritability, okay? So why would autism be heritable but not genetic? Well, this is a big area, and it's something that I work on quite a bit in my own personal private research philanthropy. And I work on the idea that things can perturb the programming of our gametes. So meaning that like a toxic exposure could affect our sperm or our egg, in my case, my former eggs. I'm past the stage where I have eggs. and that those impacts on our gametes could be passed on post-conception to our offspring and impair the way they develop. Now, it's sometimes called non-genetic inheritance, epigenetic inheritance, intergenerational inheritance. I mean, germ cell exposure. There's different terms for this phenomenon. But this phenomenon, I contend, should be very important in autism research, and it's been barely touched. They've really, if you look at the genetics and heritability research, they're only looking at what's called the DNA sequence, the nucleotide sequence. They're not looking at other factors that can affect the sperm and egg, and therefore, the next generation. It's a very complicated area. And I've written a lot of papers on it. I've given a lot of talks. I recently gave a talk on this at UCLA, and you're welcome to go to my website, which is jillescher.com, JILLESCHER.com. And I list a whole bunch of these papers and presentations on that website. And if you want to geek out, geek out. So I know it's not a perfect explanation between this whole genetics heritability question that came up in my paper, but I just wanted to address it. A lot of people are like, what? And yeah, I mean, listen, I'm not saying genetics research is dead. I mean, I think that for the most part, when you talk to geneticists, they're like, we've basically found all the rare variants that are there to be found. Like maybe there's some ultra rare variants left to be found, but those will maybe explain a handful of cases. So we're in the geneticists will fully admit that they're in a state of rapidly diminishing returns on their research. What they do say, however, is that what we should be turning to are not these genetic defects, but common variants that might be influencing autism risk. This is like to talk about common variants, this would be a whole other lecture, but let me do a quick thumbnail. All of us are different, right? We all have different genomes. We're actually like 99% the same, but there are certain parts that are different. Like I have dark hair, obviously I have brown eyes, because I have different genetic variants than people who have blonde hair and blue eyes, right? I have Mediterranean skin. Somebody else might have mahogany skin because we have different genetic variants. So, these genetic variants are called common variants, and they are harmless. They just cause they result in differences throughout the population that, of course, we can see with our own eyes. They can also influence some risk, like they can influence the risk for heart disease, for obesity. They don't necessarily cause these things, but they play a role. Maybe because the way you metabolize something, right? The gene might affect the way you metabolize something, and that might give rise to increased risk for obesity, for example. So there are lots and lots of like I have a genetic variant MTHFR677. I'm homozygous for that, and that has an effect on my homocysteine levels and my need for B12 and things like that. But it doesn't cause me neurodevelopmental disability. But it does mean that, for example, if I get nitrous oxide, that I'm much more susceptible to that than somebody else. All right, this is like I told you, this could be a very long lecture. Common variants. So the geneticist will say, well, the missing heritability of autism is found in common variants, which I find completely laughable. And I can't believe they spend a dime on it, but they do. They're spending more and more and more money looking for common variants. The initial papers that have come out looking for this have come out almost empty. They're just not finding it. So if I was the money czar of autism, I would put my money into heritability that was sort of interrupted by toxic exposures and not into common variants. But I'm obviously not on the winning side of that debate because the money is going to common variants. Okay, let's see. What else? Oh, okay, finally. Got a lot of emails from people with different hypotheses about what's causing autism, right? Because my piece pointed out how the autism rates are really increasing, and I cited a bunch of data to that effect. And let's see, there was radiation. Let's see, somebody wrote in about radiation. Somebody wrote in about, uh, oh gosh, I can't even remember what it was. It was like prayer. I think like prayer, like people who pray more. And then people said, oh, whatever the Amish are doing, they're doing right because they have low autism rates. Okay, I'm like, they do a lot of things differently. I don't know what to tell you. Um, oh my God, there were so many of them. Um, some people wrote in about actually about synthetic hormones and about like birth control pills, that kind of thing. And I think that stuff is actually really interesting. And I'm not, I don't poo-poo, the role of synthetic hormones. In fact, I wrote about that in one of my papers. Um, could be playing some kind of role. Anyway, so lots of, I didn't write them all down, but I got a lot of emails about that. Some people said, well, Jill, autism rates aren't really increasing. You are, there's research on, showing that it's just an artifact of label changing, and it's just an artifact of, new and expanded diagnostics. Okay, so, all right, listen, there are two studies that the proponents of this theory often trot out, and I just want to address both of those. There was a study from Denmark. I think it was published in 2015 by Diana Schendel and the team over there. And it looked at whether changing an administrative term for autism changed, it was causing the autism rates in Denmark to go up. So a changing categorization in the Danish administrative scheme. And it was based on cases, I think in the early to mid 80s. And it was over just a couple of years. It was a very small, time frame. And this particular very, very limited, very small and very specific to Denmark study showed that only 40% of the increase would be attributable to these to non-administrative effects. So the administrative effects, i.e., the relabeling, would maybe account for 60%. And I'm like, okay, maybe it's true back then, but that was like it's like before like autism actually became this big thing, right? Before that birth cohort where autism exploded, in this small birth cohort in a small amount of time in Denmark. Okay, fine. That can hardly be generalized. In no way, shape, or form can it be generalized to explain the phenomenon we're seeing today in the United States. Okay. The other one I often hear about is the Terry Bruja study from Leicester, England, where he went out basically and did surveys, including by telephone, to try to find the number of adults, I think over the age of 18, with autism in a very small little pinpoint part of England. And he yielded a result of 1%. And everyone said, well, oh, wow, look at that study, 1%. That's the same as the childhood rates. So therefore, autism hasn't been increasing at all because of this Bruja study in Leicester, England. No. So first of all, 1%, even if we take his study at face value, which we should not do, no one should do that. That's 1%. We are now seeing close to 3% of our children in the US, people with more severe phenotypes than the ones he found in England. Because of course he was like calling people like, it's like a phone survey. Can you imagine my kids answering a phone survey? It's not going to happen. So there's that. And there's also the fact that, it found people with incredibly mild symptoms. And, they were kind of giving people an autism label who I think maybe were very unlike, the children that are diagnosed with autism we see today. So apples and oranges. So anyway, do I think that maybe some of autism can be attributed to the broadening of the diagnostics? I mean, in some systems, yeah, sure. In some systems at the very top, yeah. But autism has been increasing at all levels in all systems, even the systems with very restrictive definitions. The school, talk to any school administrator about how much more they've had to invest in their kids with in the growing population of kids with autism that they never used to see before. I mean, I could go on and on with examples. Okay. Anyway, I think I babbled really quite long enough. You can read the article yourself and you can come to your own conclusions. Autism is an area where, as I said, we really should be very, very humble because honestly, very little is understood. We probably understand 5% of what's going on in autism. 95% remains to be discovered. We should be, quite humble in the face of autism, but we should also be extremely alarmed about its rapid growth and about the absolute insanity of sugarcoating this incredibly devastating and serious disability. I respect people who say that I have autism and I'm not impaired. I feel like it's a gift in my life. I'm just different. That's fine. Go ahead. I'm not going to tell you how to live your life or what to think about yourself. But, when we're talking about the great bulk of autisms, we're talking about people with some level of life limiting impairment. And that has huge repercussions for us as a society. So with that note, I bid you adieu. And I'm very, very sorry about Autism Confidential's absence. I assure you we will come back and better than ever. Okay. I appreciate hearing from you. You can write in to us at info@ncsautism.org. I love getting your comments about this podcast. I love getting your suggestions. Please keep them coming. All right. Bye, everybody.